Hi, my name is Melissa Foster, and today I'm going to be talking about the deaf community not entrusting hearing interpreters and why that is. I'm also going to be talking about hearing privilege. So, recently there's been a big rift in the deaf community and interpreters, and it's led to a lot of mistrust. We hearing interpreters need to start looking at ourselves and the way we behave and notice the, our, um, our privilege. Um, for some deaf people, that privilege might be easily identifiable, but for hearing interpreters, I think that we can easily lose sight of that. If you're trying to confront your privilege, you shouldn't. You can admit that you do have that privilege, but it's hard to really look at it yourself. There's a man named Michel Dinsrin, and he wrote a book about white people trying to understand their own privilege. And here's a quote from that book. The one sentence I want to focus on that quote. The tiny little aggressions. I want to think about that as an interpreter. What kind of tiny microaggressions are we committing onto deaf people? If a deaf person says that we're privileged and we try to accept that we try to say that we're not, we need to look inwards and try to see if we actually are or not, and how to confront that privilege. Hearing interpreters have a lot of experience working with team interpreters, and sometimes they're not professional. Maybe they're breaking ethics, or they're just signing things wrong. But we do our best to ignore that and just try to interpret away. But deaf people always ask me, why do interpreters not take responsibility in trying to discuss and fix the problem? Instead, what we do is we just kind of protect our own and kind of ignore the deaf community, and that's privilege. We hearing interpreters need to take up more responsibility in trying to be equitable and try to work with each other to fix those problems. Hearing interpreters have also informed me that if a deaf person was not satisfied with their interpreting work, they should just be direct and tell me. Well, in a perfect world, yeah, I agree they should. But you're ignoring something important, and that's the power imbalance that deaf people sometimes have. Sometimes they do speak up, and it's not satisfactory. But sometimes when they speak up, they get labeled as difficult, or they struggle to find a new interpreter to deal with their situations. That kind of information as to who the deaf people who are difficult to work with sometimes spreads to the interpreting community. So interpreting community, yeah, we should be supporting each other and trying to make good decisions, but at what cost? Because labeling some deaf people as difficult to work with, I think sometimes makes hearing interpreters a little bit clicky, and I think that's where a lot of the privilege comes from. So that's where that power imbalance is. I actually have another quote from the same author, and I'm going to read it here. So that's another way we can view that power imbalance is that, um, the deaf side of things, they might see that there's that power imbalance. And we, working in the interpreting profession, um, when we're done with a job, uh, sometimes we get a big thank you or I love you from the deaf user. And maybe we get some positive feedback and we say, oh yeah, we love feedback. We have an open mind, no ego. But if that feedback is a little bit negative and maybe it's honest, we sometimes turn that away. Do we always ask that person for feedback? And if so, why? If that information goes through an interpreter, um, So, sometimes we're getting feedback just from interpreters, and it's more like a work meeting. Maybe it's a class, whatever. But is it fair to ask that? Uh, it's important. I mean, yes, you can watch interpreters for feedback, but it's important to take on honest feedback from the deaf community as well. So that power imbalance, when the deaf community feels like they have to be careful with their words, we hearing interpreters don't realize that we can have a lot of power, and that's still there after we're done interpreting. And we're putting the deaf community a lot of times in risk positions when we don't take on that uh, or don't realize that power imbalance. We say that deaf people should definitely trust us, but trust needs to be earned over and over and over again. Trust needs to be earned. Over the years, if you're working with several different interpreters and you're arriving at a job for the first time and you immediately have an emotional connection and a friendship, um, that means that that trust is starting to get built. And you think that I'm a trustworthy person and I'm a friend with the deaf community, I'm an ally. There's a writer named Mia Makenza that was titled No More Allies. And let me read a quote from there as well. So ally is not a name or a label. Really, it's an action. We as hearing interpreters have to build that friendship and trust. It's not always immediate. And it's sometimes we're privileged because of that, because we have to earn that trust over and over again every day, every time. Every time we use this language, we have to try and earn that trust again. And here's another quote from the same author. Yeah, sure, it's a lot of work being an ally, but if you look at that list of oppression and oppressed people, it fits that definition perfectly. So how do we improve moving forward? First, hearing interpreters have to recognize that we are honored to be in the deaf community every day. We need to listen more to deaf people. And we need to learn about the different kinds of privilege that we have, like white privilege, straight privilege, male privilege, uh, able privilege, and then apply that to our work with the deaf community. And in that way, interpreters can work with each other and try to advance and grow with each other. And we can also grow with the deaf community as well. We have to listen to the deaf community without defense. And if we mess up, take responsibility and apologize. If you make a mistake, learn from it and try to move forward. In the big picture, we need to start help building trust again with the deaf community. And we need to work with the deaf community moving forward on that. Confronting our privilege is not always comfortable. And at first, it might feel painful and shameful. But at the same time, it's an opportunity to look back at what you've done and think about how to change and improve moving forward. Interpreters tend to get really clicky, even though we're entering the deaf community every day, using their language and culture. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to self-analyze our behavior and confront our privilege and really work as an ally with the deaf community moving forward. So working as an interpreter with the deaf community, how are we influencing our own special kind of hearing interpreter privilege? And what does that look like? Remember that quote, tiny but terrifying aggressions? As an interpreter, what kind of tiny but terrifying aggressions have you noticed, or you yourself have maybe influenced on deaf people? Okay, the rest of this, I think, is just her restating these questions. So.